Welcome back to the Louie File. All right, we recently started. This is a part 2. I'm not sure how many parts there's going to be, but it's actually a study in Ephesians, but we haven't really gotten to the letter to the Ephesians yet because I decided to walk through what in the book of Acts, starting in chapter 19, what Paul, what can we discover about Paul's connection to Ephesus as far as the Bible before we read the letter he wrote to the Ephesians. Last video we started in Acts 19 and went through the first 20 verses, so I'm not going to rehash all that. I would love it if you went back and watched that to catch up. It'd be great. So today we're just going to pick up in Acts 19 verse 21. It says, "Now, after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, 'After I've been there, I must also see Rome.' And having sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. About that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way." You see, Jesus, the way, Christianity, if you will, wasn't called Christianity, it was just called the way. Jesus said he was the way, right? The truth and the life. So people that were following Christ, they were called the way. So there's a disturbance concerning the way. Acts 19:24, "For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades and said, 'Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Not only is there danger that this trade of ours fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the world worship will even be dethroned from her magnificence.'" Oh man. So this dude named Demetrius is feeling the burn in his pocketbook. So Paul brings the gospel, the news of Jesus Christ and his saving power, the one true God, into this region of Ephesus, and it causes quite a stir. There is obviously, according to these verses, a temple established for this person they call Artemis. I think elsewhere she might also be known as Diana, depending on the translation. So he's gathering up the people around him. He's saying, you know what? We make these little statues, silver shrines. If we allow the Apostle Paul, this guy, to keep teaching Jesus Christ, isn't it going to bring shame or a bad reputation on our goddess Artemis? And not only that, we're going to go broke. I always love this because, you find out where their love really is when your pocketbook is in question. And they made their living off of making these little idols. And they knew that when Jesus Christ comes on the scene, or they started to discover that their business was going to drop. This would be similar to someone that owned a liquor store, right? Or sold anything that might be contrary to what God would be after. Now, I'm not saying if you drink, I'm not trying to get into the idea of drinking, whether that's something a Christian does or doesn't do, but let me just use this as an example. If I'm a bar owner and all of a sudden my business starts slacking, and then I start realizing, well, all my regulars have gotten born again and they quit drinking. What am I going to do? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get upset at whoever it is that told them that they didn't need to drink anymore. Who was it that freed them from that? I'm going to go find out. So that's what's happening here. He says that not only is there danger that this trade of ours will fall into disrepute, but, so in other words, not only is it going to hurt our pocketbook, but also that the temple and the goddess of Artemis be regarded as worthless. So he's appealing to them based on their pocketbook, and he's also appealing to them in their sense of spiritual pride in their goddess. So Acts 19:28, it says, when they heard this and were filled with rage, see, he stirred them up. They began crying out, saying, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So it's on now, folks. See, this is not much different than the Old Testament battles. You had God moving through and in and as Israel in battle against the heathen nations. And so it was a showdown, one time after another with Yahweh, the one true God, the God of Israel, fighting these other gods, these would-be gods of the other nations. And here we go again. Now it's just on a more personal ground level here. But it says, Acts 19:29, the city was filled with the confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. So they snatched them up. And they're bringing them out, and there's a big crowd gathering. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. See, they were afraid for his life. Also, some of the Asiarchs who were friends of his sent to him and repeatedly urged him to not venture into the theater. Do not go out there, Paul. They will rip you apart. So then, some were shouting one thing, and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. Isn't that just like what happens? I mean, you see it after big ball games. Well, I guess they would know that one. But a lot of times something gets spread on social media, or you see it on television, and next thing you know, there's a big mob in the street, and they're screaming and yelling. But a lot of times I've seen reporters go up and they'll say, well, what exactly is it that you're protesting? And a bunch of them don't even know. They have no clue. They just saw a crowd, and they get out there, and sometimes they do it so they can loot. They bust out windows, steal televisions, tennis shoes, and they don't even care what the uproar is about. They could care less. They have no stand, or they have no dog in the fight. All they want to do is get some free stuff out of the store downtown because chaos has ensued. So if you were to take a reporter and a TV camera into Ephesus at this point and say, what is it you're so upset about? I would say a lot of them would say, oh no, I just like the chaos. I just like to rant and rave about something. So they didn't even know. So Acts 19:33, some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry rose from them all as they shouted for about 2 hours, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. After quieting the crowd, the town clerk said, men of Ephesus, what man is there after all who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis, and of the image which fell down from heaven? So, since these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session, and proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful assembly. For indeed we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's events, since there is no real cause for it. And in this connection we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering. After saying this, he dismissed the assembly. Oh my gosh. See, it is a spiritual battle. So we have Paul introducing Jesus Christ and the gospel message of Jesus being God in the flesh, put himself in a position to die for us. He put himself, it was God's plan that Jesus himself would be put to death by the hands of wicked men. That's what it says back in Acts chapter 2. So that was his plan all along, that Jesus would die as a sin offering. In fact, the Bible actually says he became sin so that we could become the righteousness of God in him. But the conflict here is that he's presenting Jesus. He's presenting the one true God and the one true message of salvation. And these people had been living under a delusion, under this goddess worship. So when Jesus is presented and people come to realize, you know what, I think that's right. I think I'll take that gospel. I think I'll take that good news. I think I will receive the gospel and I'll be set free. Something that Artemis could not ever do for them. Could not. You know, the Old Testament pagan worship, they had to sacrifice. They would sacrifice in hopes that they could get their God to perform on their behalf. On the other hand, Israel would perform sacrifices as thank offerings. They would have all different kinds of sacrifices, but it wasn't a way to manipulate God. At least, I don't think that was the original intention. But what I would like for you to see in this is full-on spiritual battle that Paul has found himself involved in here in Ephesus. And it will play an important role in the letter to the Ephesians as we get to it, which is we're probably going to start in the actual letter to the Ephesians in the next video. So I really need you to stick around for that. These two videos I've just done are basically backdrops or background insight into what Paul was dealing with in this region. So when we start to read the letter to the Ephesians, I will point out to you and remind you of this Artemis or Diana worship and this goddess, because the letter to the Ephesians is way more about spiritual warfare. It's not just Ephesians 6 where it talks about we wrestle not with flesh and blood but against powers, principalities, and evil forces and wickedness. That is a theme throughout the letter. It's not just in chapter 6. In fact, I heard someone say one time that Ephesians, the letter to the Ephesians, is actually like the Joshua of the New Covenant. And at first I thought, what? I don't really understand that. But as I read Ephesians with that in mind, or as you might hopefully see, it does make sense. The letter, the book of Joshua is about a book of conquest. It's about Joshua taking over the promised land and filling it up with God's chosen people, because he said it was their land. So there was lots of battles that were going on in Israel in a physical sense. Now in Ephesians, we start to see that there is a battle also in the spiritual sense. So the Ephesian letter is a letter of victory over the enemy, albeit it is an unseen enemy. But just because it's unseen doesn't mean that it's not there. So I tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. This concludes our backdrop to Ephesians. So join me on the next Louie file, and we'll get right into the letter to the Ephesians, and we'll see how all this plays into the context of that letter. Thank you so much for joining me. I will see you the next time on the Louie file.